This unassuming little PTZ streaming camera packs a whole lot more punch than it seems at first glance. And when you see everything this little device has to offer, I think you'll see what I mean when I say it has the power to revolutionize live streaming as we know it. This is the OBSBOT Tail Air. And just to let you know, OBSBOT is sponsoring this review, but they don't have any influence over what I say about it. And these are my honest thoughts, including sharing some areas where I really do think it falls short of its potential. But I do think that despite these shortcomings, the Tail Air really does have a lot more to offer than even I realized when I first received it. So first of all, let's quickly go through the unboxing. The Tail Air comes in this really nice red packaging, and you get a quick start guide and a really nice carry case. It's really high quality. You get a USB-C cable, plus a data and power splitter. I'll talk more about that later. Then you get a USB-C to USB-A adapter, and then of course the Tail Air itself. So let's talk a bit about the design and the build quality of the Tail Air. Now out of the box, as you saw, I think it's got a really nice design. It features a 2-axis gimbal, which gives you that pan and tilt ability. It doesn't turn a full 360, but it does get quite close. I think the only downside to the overall build, I just kind of wish that when you turn the camera off, that it would tilt and face downwards. Currently when you turn it off, it stays tilted up, and I've noticed this tends to collect dust, which is kind of annoying. The body is made out of a high quality plastic that feels really sturdy, and actually has a decent amount of weight to it. Not in a bad way where it feels excessively heavy, but in a good way where it feels like it's high quality. The whole camera comes in at 344.5 grams. On the base, it features a micro HDMI output, which I actually think is a really nice addition because it just gives you that one extra option in terms of output, depending on what your setup looks like. It's got a micro SD card slot, so you can record directly in the camera itself, which again, I think is a great feature. It's a little bit tricky to get a micro SD card in and out of the slot for some reason, but it's not too big of a deal. Now it also has a microphone jack, which I think is actually a really cool feature. So this enables you to plug in external microphones, so you don't have to just rely on the inbuilt microphone that the camera has. It's got 4 battery indicator lights on the front, so you can see the battery levels, a USB-C port and a power button on the back. And then the base has a rubber ring to prevent scratches, plus it has a 3/4 inch thread so that you can attach it to all sorts of different stands or tripods. And then lastly, it has a couple of little holes where the microphones are located. So overall, I'd say the design, it looks great and it feels like it's really solid quality. All right, so I'm just going to quickly go through some of the key features before we get into the actual performance testing that I did. So in terms of video, it shoots in 4K 30 and it does up to 60 frames per second in 1080p, and it does include a HDR mode, which I've actually been really impressed with. I think it performs really well and gives you a lot more dynamic range than the standard mode does. Now, one of the biggest draw cards to the Tail Air is the AI tracking, and I'll talk more about this later, but it has AI support to track humans, pets, and objects, and I'll go through the actual performance of the tracking in the next section. Then as part of the AI features, it has gesture controls, so using gestures you can do things like zoom, start tracking, turn off tracking, and start and stop recording. It's got an internal 1500 milliamp hour battery, which I think is pretty cool because it means you can use the camera anywhere. And then lastly, the standard package includes a USB-C splitter that enables you to use one port for data transmission and then another port for your power supply. That is obviously already so much to unpack here, but I personally haven't really seen other cameras on the market that have this combination of features. But before we get into the actual meat of how this camera has so much potential for streaming, I'll just give you a brief overview of some of the more obvious features that you might be curious about, like the tracking and the video performance. First of all, let's talk a bit about the usability of this camera. Is it actually easy to use? Is it easy to set up? And I would say overall, my experience has been really good. Now, the main way you access the camera controls for the Tail Air is through the phone/iPad app. This is the OBSBOT Start app, and it's really quite fully featured. It gives you a live preview of everything that you're seeing on the camera. Plus, it gives you full camera settings, including things like the ISO, the shutter speed, and the white balance of your image. It has a grid display. It has the ability to flip the image, and you can also set preset camera positions so that you can quickly jump between different presets. There's also a desktop app which you can install on Mac and PC, and this gives you controls over most of the same things as the phone app, with a couple of extra features like facial touch-ups and adding different looks to your image. Now, one really cool feature that I quite like is the director's grid, and this is essentially a kind of multi-view where you can see previews of your different preset positions as well as wide, medium, and close-up shots of your subject. From here, you can quickly tap on the different previews to to change what's being sent to your live broadcast, which I think could actually come in really handy. You can also start and stop recording from the app, as well as control all of the tracking features, which is the next thing that I wanted to talk about, the actual performance of the AI tracking. And I would say overall, my experience has been good. For me, I've mainly been using the camera just in my office, and in that setting, it's been excellent. Some of the best tracking I've personally used. I did use it at one point outdoors at a friend's wedding. And in this scenario where there was lots of different people and the subject that I was tracking kind of went a bit further away from the camera, it did get a little bit confused and it wasn't quite sure who to track and ended up drifting in the wrong direction. And I think for more important things like that, you'd probably be using manual controls anyway. Similar with the object tracking, I'd say overall it was good, especially if it's a clear object and is high contrast. I found it struggled a little bit more when there was less contrast, or if it was an object that wasn't quite as clear. But again, to me, that's fairly standard. I would say it's to be expected. Now, when it comes to the actual image quality of the camera, it's excellent, and I don't think you'll be disappointed. To me, it almost looks as good as my mirrorless camera when I've got my mirrorless set up in a webcam mode, except for the depth of field. It doesn't have as much depth of field as my mirrorless camera does. But to me, it looks so good. I've started using it as my main podcasting camera, and I really love that it can shoot in 4K. Again, the HDR mode looks really good for the most part. I have noticed that in really high contrast areas in that HDR mode, movement in that section of the image can cause some kind of strange artifacts. I'm not quite sure what's causing that, but it's something to be aware of. And I did find the autofocus was a little bit slow sometimes, mainly when it was set to autofocus on my face. I'm not quite sure why this is. I found this in both low light and bright light situations. However, the low light performance of the camera is really good as well. I'd be very confident using this in dimly lit situations as well as in full bright sunlight scenarios. All right, so let's talk about what I think is actually the really exciting thing about this camera. And there's kind of 3 levels to it, and I'll get to all 3 levels. The first level to me is essentially what we've just talked about, which is the fact that it's a really solid AI-powered PTZ camera. So that's kind of your base level. The next level to me is all the connection abilities that this camera has. And let me just get into that a little bit. So first of all, I would say I can't really imagine any scenario where you couldn't fit this camera into your current setup or a setup that you're trying to build. There are just so many connection options with this camera. You've got that micro HDMI port. So you can literally have a HDMI cable coming straight out of the camera into something like a capture card. You can also just directly connect the Tail Air via USB-C. But to me, the power of this camera really starts to come in when you talk about networking. So first of all, you can connect the Tail Air to your network via Wi-Fi. And you can do this directly in the phone app or on the desktop app. And you'll be able to get a live feed from the camera. And as long as your camera is within Wi-Fi range, you can literally put it anywhere around your house, around your office, wherever you've got your Wi-Fi signal set up. So this already is a pretty big game changer because you're not restricted to having the Tail Air physically connected, which gives you heaps more options in terms of camera placement. Next, if you're in a location where you either don't have access to the Wi-Fi signal or there's no Wi-Fi signal at all, the Tail Air can actually create its own Wi-Fi network that you can connect to. So again, using the app, you can switch on the Tail Air's Wi-Fi, connect to it, and away you go. And again, to me, this is super handy, especially if you're shooting stuff outdoors, like for example, weddings or outdoor events. You can wirelessly connect to the camera, and as long as you've got data on your phone that you can use to stream, away you go. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Hey Nick, Wi-Fi is really cool, but it's not the most stable connection method for high quality video. And I would agree. However, OBSBOT has actually already thought of this. First, there's an Ethernet adapter that you can buy separately, which enables you to connect the Tail Air directly into your network. And this will be way more stable than a Wi-Fi connection will be. It even supports power over Ethernet, so you can use your Ethernet cable to supply power to the Tail Air, which I think is pretty cool. If you don't have power over Ethernet, there's also a USB-C port, which you can plug in a power supply. Now, once again, this opens up so many options for connection depending on your setup. And then lastly, it also supports NDI. Now, if you haven't heard of NDI before, it's basically a video protocol that lets you stream all sorts of different video feeds over a network with very little latency and very high quality. Now, for this, you do need to buy a separate NDI license key, but if you're already familiar with NDI and you use it in your current setup, it could be totally worth it because it is known to be really reliable and low latency. And that to me is the really exciting thing about this camera. It's just got so many connection options on top of a really solid base level camera. So you've got the level 1, which is just a really solid PTZ camera. Level 2 is the fact that it's got all these different connection options. And then the third layer in this streaming stack, if you will, is the fact that OBSBOT has actually a really solid ecosystem and enables you to build out your streaming setup with these Tail Air cameras to cater to pretty much any size of production. You could start out with just the camera, and that would be a great option for a simple podcast, for example. But then if you combine multiple Tail Airs into a multicam setup and you use some of the more advanced connection techniques, then you start to get a really fully fledged broadcast solution. If you do have more professional needs, there's all sorts of accessories that you can add on to the Tail Air from OBSBOT. Things like the Ethernet adapter, a remote control, the NDI support, and you can even get ND filters for the lens so you can use it better in different contexts. Now, all that said, there are still some negatives that you should be aware of before you buy this camera. The first is that setup can be a bit finicky and tricky with the more advanced connection methods. And this is partly to be expected. I spent several hours trying to get the Ethernet and NDI to work properly. Once I got it all set up, it was fine and worked really well. But that's for me as someone who has a background using NDI and networking with video. So I'd say the advanced connection methods aren't so much for beginners, as there is a bit of a learning curve. But in some ways, that's my point. You can really cater this camera depending on your experience level and your needs. Another downside is that some of the control features that you've got on the app, you can't actually access on the desktop app. For example, you can't do object selection tracking from the desktop app, and you don't have the director grid, which I think is a bit of a missed opportunity. I think it would be really powerful to have these tools in a desktop app so that, again, for more pro level users, they could run the entire system from a laptop, for example. And then lastly, I did notice that it gets quite hot. I haven't noticed any overheating issues, so I wouldn't say it's a real problem, but it's just worth noting when you do touch it, just make sure you're careful if you've been streaming for an hour or two, because it does get quite toasty. So in conclusion, I think this camera is actually really pretty amazing. And like I said at the start of the video, I think at first glance, it kind of just looks like another overpowered webcam that you don't really need because it's got features that you'll never use. But I think that's what people might be misunderstanding about the Tail Air. It's not really designed as a glorified webcam. It's actually designed as a fully featured pan tilt zoom streaming camera with huge scope to be able to expand the setup that it's plugged into. So I definitely think it's really worth picking up for that type of solution. Let me know what your thoughts are. Have I changed your initial impressions of this camera? And if you are looking at starting your own podcast, then I definitely recommend watching this video here where I go through the entire process step by step of how I create, film, and upload my own podcast.